Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
My goodness, we've been talking about the EU renegotiation for months now, and that particular drama grinds slowly to a climax later this week. But a huge potential problem has loomed into view. It's that frustrating thing about the EU that no one is quite in charge. So can we know what the rules are, even if we agree them? Well, there are two issues here. The European Court of Justice may say the deal is incompatible with our treaty obligations, and the European Parliament may say they don't want to enact the bits they have some influence over. Is this an important oops or a silly distraction? Chris Cook has been looking at it.
David Cameron has shaken a lot of hands and eaten a lot of dinners, all in the name of renegotiating Britain's relationship with the EU. And in the next few days, he will hope that he can get Britain's new terms of membership signed off by the other member states. Now, if David Cameron's week all goes to plan, it should end up with a meeting here in these inconspicuous Georgian buildings. This is Downing Street, and on Friday, if he gets a deal, he'll be holding a cabinet, and that will mark the official start of the referendum campaign. After that, ministers will be free to campaign for Brexit if they so wish. But of course, to get there, the Prime Minister first of all has to get a deal from Europe. Nina Schick is from a think tank sympathetic to the Prime Minister and thinks he will manage to overcome the hurdles to a deal.
Well, I think on the issue of economic governance, which is one of Cameron's basket, which is about ensuring that non-Eurozone countries cannot be discriminated against by the Eurozone countries, a mechanism for how that's going to work has not yet been decided. And I think certain Eurozone countries are afraid that the UK might be given too much and have effectively what counters as a veto on Eurozone issues. And I think the details of how that mechanism is going to work might be a stumbling block in the talks.
Now, just a few hundred metres from where David Cameron will be holding his cabinet meeting on Friday afternoon, another big European meeting will be happening at much the same time. Grassroots Out, a pro-Brexit campaign, will be having a rally here at the QE2 Centre in Westminster. And what they and other Eurosceptics will argue is that the deal David Cameron will bring back from Europe will be incomplete because a big chunk of it will need the approval of the European Parliament, something it won't get until after any referendum.
Hi Martin.
Morning, Dave.
All right, morning, good to see you. All well?
Technical problems.
Good. Yes, sorry.
The President of the European Parliament, meeting the Prime Minister here, wasn't very helpful today.
I encourage British people to vote on the basis of the outcome of Thursday, to vote yes. Then we start a legislative procedure, which will clarify and help to solve the problems addressed by the frame, which will be accepted on Thursday. I hope accepted on Thursday.
Well, there are still certain things that need to pass through the European Parliament, and most notably is the emergency brake on migrants' access to in-work welfare. However, certain things come into effect immediately afterwards, and those are not insignificant. This includes, of course, the red cards for national parliaments to block EU legislation where it's unwanted, and of course also the understanding that the UK is not bound to ever closer union, so it's the first time it has an opt-out out of this.
So for a lot of potential Leave voters, migration is a huge issue, and they would obviously be a bit unnerved if the European Parliament were to unpick the migration parts of this package. So do we think it's likely that MEPs might do that?
I think the President of the European Parliament has said that, first of all, it's going to be a speedy process, and one that will be studied very carefully. But I think if the other 27 countries have agreed through their heads of government to the package, I think it's highly likely that the European Parliament will consider that as a good signal.
But the European Parliament could well fiddle with the deal and perhaps water it down. That's what Eurosceptics fear.
The Prime Minister may get a deal, an incy-wincy little deal, but the point is, after that deal, and say he wins the referendum, the European Parliament behind me can scupper the deal, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg can rule it out of order. It's rather like selling a motor car and saying, isn't it lovely and shiny, and you can buy it, but please, you can't test the engine first. It simply doesn't work.
So could the European Court strike down the deal? Well, we've spoken to experts today who think it's likely legislation could be drafted that would be safe from that. So tensions are high, so are the stakes, and perhaps that's why today Prince William intervened in a speech. Or did he? You judge.
In an increasingly turbulent world, our ability to unite in common action with other nations is essential. It is the bedrock of our security and prosperity and is central to your work. Right now, the big questions with which you wrestle in the UN, NATO, the Middle East and elsewhere are predicated on your commitment to working in partnership with others.
An heir to the throne's hints may not change many votes, but nor will the details of what deals Mr Cameron has shaken hands on. This week's negotiations may, however, kick off a referendum fight ending in June on what exactly we want Britain to be.
Are you hopeful of a deal, Prime Minister?
The tension is building up. Well, I'm Chris Cook reporting there. I'm joined in the studio by Lucy Thomas, who's Deputy Director of Britain Stronger in Europe, and from the European Parliament by the German MEP, a Green MEP, Ska Keller. Good evening to you both. Ska Keller, look, I'd really like to start with you. I'm just interested, do you have concerns about what you've heard about, you know, the deal that Britain is getting, particularly on migrant benefits?
Well, there is a deal that Cameron has achieved, and it's clear that the Parliament will have to play a role in that. I think that shouldn't come as a surprise. The European Union, after all, is not some bureaucratic construct where only bureaucrats decide. No, by far not. It's the Parliament who does legislation, and if Cameron wants to change legislation, then of course we in the Parliament will have a close look at it. Many details are still missing. Of course, for us it's very important as Greens that we're not applying discriminatory rules to some citizens and others not. But we will look at the proposal when it then comes. After all, this referendum is about much more than what Cameron has been proposing in his deals with other heads of state and government. It's really about the future of the UK. It's about the future of the European Union and whether we face the challenges of today's world together or not.
But hang on, are you really saying that it is not possible for the governments of the EU to make a deal? Because that effectively is what you're saying. You're saying that they can sign whatever deal they want, but that doesn't pass through the EU because the MEPs have their say. Now, let me put the question again, or put this question.
Well, actually,
go on.
Yeah.
No, go on.
Well, the European Union has a parliament, like Britain has a parliament, and parliaments have some rights, as they should have in any democracy. And part of that is amending legislation. Now, a lot of the bids that Cameron has been negotiating actually go past the European Parliament. We don't have a role in that. Unfortunately, I would say there's very few pieces of that actually have to go through Parliament. But of course, how would you do a law if not by Parliament? In Britain, laws pass through the Parliament. The same goes for the European Union.
Okay, let me ask you this. Suppose you have reservations, as I think you do, about the benefit package. Is it the case that when you come to vote on the British deal, that you will vote taking into account the political necessity for the EU to stick by its deal with the British? Or will you just say, well, I'm against changing benefit rules, so I'm going to vote against? Will you effectively do the right thing, if you like, take into account the bigger political question than just the benefits or not?
Well, as I said, we don't have the proposals yet, but I can assure you that everybody will keep in mind what the bigger political effects of that are very clearly. But it's also very clear that we can't just do changes to laws without asking the Parliament. I'm sure everyone here is aware of what's happening at the Council. Surely, as I said, we think that discrimination should not happen to EU citizens. We are in an area of the rule of law which needs to apply to all. That's very clear, but we're ready to look into proposals when they come, absolutely.
We have this word, something being a formality in English, right? And that means it's obviously you have to get your vote, and it's just a formality because we all know how you're going to vote, and it's just a kind of nodding it through. It sounds to me like you're not saying this is just a formality. It sounds to me like you're saying this is a proper vote. This is Parliament exercising its right to change, amend, or reject legislation.
well, if parliaments were only there to nod things through, then we could as well get rid of parliaments, but we don't want that. We want to strengthen democracy in the European Union. There's been a lot of criticism about European Union not being democratic enough. I think those people that shouldn't criticize us for actually exercising our democratic role. We are directly elected by the European Union citizens. I think citizens of the European Union, also of Great Britain, will expect from us that we have a very close look at what's proposed, just as we have a very close look at any other legislative proposal.
Keller, thank you very much indeed. Well, let me put those points to Lucy Thomas, representing the In campaign. What probability do you put on the deal actually holding in the Parliament and in the European Court?
I think, first of all, let's get the deal done. We have to remember lots of the elements are still being negotiated, and we'll see what happens on Thursday and Friday this week. But really the principle here is what 28 EU leaders have agreed to. I would say, and indeed it is, a legally binding decision. It is an international law decision.
And how do you impose that on the European Court, who can say your binding decision, as you call it, conflicts with non-discrimination provisions or free movement provisions that we already have written into a treaty? You can't just sign an agreement that conflicts with a treaty. That doesn't happen. Well,
it is actually an international legal document.
It is,
which will be deposited at the UN. So it may not be an EU treaty, but it is a legally binding document.
Right. And what happens, Lucy, if it conflicts with the EU treaty and a European court says, guys, that conflicts with a treaty you've signed?
Well, that's what they're negotiating about now. So the whole menu of options they've been looking at during this renegotiation has been looking about how do you do it within EU law. And indeed, as Nina said in the piece earlier, loads of these elements will be enforceable straight away. So making sure, for example, that the UK Parliament has more of a say, that we're not dragged into ever closer union, that the non-Eurozone countries aren't outvoted. These are really important things.
Important stuff, and those ones don't have to go to the Parliament. What probability do you put on the benefit package getting through the European Parliament? 90%? 98%? You're sure as hell isn't 100%, is it?
Well, I wouldn't put a figure on it because I don't think that's how these things work. No, what I do think, though, it's a really important principle. Can Britain, can any EU member state be part of the EU and reform it and make it better?
Well, that's the question you should put to the EU. You're wanting to stay in. The EU is unable to give us that question because they cannot, and we've heard the arguments from Scar there, they cannot just dragoon the Parliament into acquiescing into something that David Cameron negotiates.
Well, what it comes down to, and it's actually what Scar said herself, if 28 EU leaders agree to something, then it would almost be remiss of the Parliament to then overturn all of that stuff. By the way, those EU leaders have all been democratically elected in each of their countries. You know, Angela Merkel in Scar Keller's country, you know, she has agreed to this deal on behalf of the German people. And actually, Martin Schulz, earlier on in that press conference today, said the European Parliament doesn't have a veto, and he himself has been clear that it's the European Parliament's duty to pass legislation quickly on this.
Lucy Thomas and Scar Keller, thanks both very much indeed.